The echo of an ancient myth. Close your eyes for a moment. Breathe deeply. Loosen the shoulders. Let the modern world fade as smoke underwater. Tonight, you're not in your bed. Tonight, we cross the invisible edges of time to enter a whisper that has traveled by millennia, an echo that never extinguished at all. Atlantis. Long before the maps existed, even before the man dominated the iron or the printing press, there was already talk of it. A distant, beautiful, powerful, wise, and terrible place. A complete continent, with gold-bathed temples, elephants walking between hanging gardens, longer channels than rivers, towers that touched the sky, and laws that promised eternal justice. And, as with everything that seems perfect, one day it sank forever. On one night, they say, Atlantis was swallowed by the sea. But what really is Atlantis? A myth born from sleep? A warning wrapped in history? Or the fragmented memory of a world that really existed? Atlantis is not simply a lost place. It is an idea that refuses to die. A mirror in which humanity has sought its reflection for more than 2,000 years. The first time we heard his name clearly was in the mouth of a Greek philosopher, Plato. In his dialogue called Timeo, written in the 4th century BC, Plato reports that Solon, an Athenian sage, traveled to Egypt and listened to a story that changed him forever. There, the priests told him about a fabulous island beyond the Hercules columns, what we call the Gibraltar Strait today. A prosperous land that had existed more than 9,000 years ago. Plato does not present the story as a fantastic legend, but as a forgotten truth. And that is what gives him his strength. Ambiguity. Neither completely real, completely fictitious. Atlantis moves between history and myth, and that movement is what keeps it alive. In the Timeo, there is talk of a war between the Atlanteans, who had fallen into arrogance, and the Athenians, who still represented virtue. And although the Athenians win, in the end, the divine punishment falls on all. The earth breaks, the waters rise, and Atlantis disappears. But Plato didn't stop there. In your subsequent dialogue, Critias tries to deepen the description of this lost land. It is there where the myth acquires body, shape, colors. In Critias, we are told how the gods divided the earth, and how Poseidon, lord of the seas, was given an incomparable beauty island. A young woman named Cleito lived in her, with whom the god fell in love. To protect her, she erected concentric circles of land and water, and in the center built a divine palace. Cleito gave birth to 5 pairs of twins, and the greatest of them, Atlas, became king and gave his name to the island. The story continues to describe a vast and advanced empire. Atlantis had wise laws, consecrated temples, aqueducts that challenged logic, and a natural wealth that exceeded any other known region. Metals abounded, including a mysterious mineral called orichalco. There were exotic animals, and among them, elephants. Its cities were connected by bridges and channels, and its central port was a wonder of engineering. Imagine a giant water surrounded by earth rings, all interconnected, all vibrating alive. But not everything was harmony. Over time, the Atlanteans moved away from the divine path. They became greedy, violent, and forgot their roots. It was then that, according to history, the gods decided to purify the earth. On a night of cataclysm and fire, the entire continent disappeared under the waves. There was no trace, only legends. And yet, here we are. Centuries later, we still pronounce your name with a sigh, Atlantis. The word vibrates with mystery, as if something deep in our ancestral memory knew that, somewhere, under the waters, something real sleeps. Maybe a memory, maybe a longing, maybe a warning. The echo of this ancient myth continues to cross the centuries, not because we have evidence of its existence, but because its history tells us about us, of our glory and our fall, what we can build and what we can lose. Tonight, you are not here to solve an enigma. You are here to let you carry, by the voices of the past, for the sighs of the sea, because of the possibility that once, in some corner of the world, there was such a perfect place that the gods could not allow it to last. Sleep now with that thought. May the waters take you. May the echo envelop you. And if you dream of gold towers and infinite channels, you may have finally found the Atlantis.
Part 2. Impossible Geography. The silence of the world is not always silence of the soul. Sometimes, between the mild murmur of the wind and the sway of the waves, something older that memory calls us. It is a voiceless voice, a whisper without direction. And that whisper, again and again, seems to point out a lost, submerged place, forgotten by time and logic. Tonight, we are going to follow that voice, to look for Atlantis not in the books, but in the cracks of the planet, because there are questions that science has not yet closed. Where was the Atlantis? In what corner of the earth does its ruins rest? What if it was never a place, but many? What if it is everywhere and in none? The geography of Atlantis is impossible because it refuses to stay in a single map. Since Plato mentioned it, the dreamers and the wise have tried to draw their coordinates, mark it with ink, put limits to the myth. But Atlantis escapes change, language, landscape. It is an archaeological mirage that shines differently under each sun. The first theory leads us to the Mediterranean, cradle of civilizations, scenario of myths and tragedies. Some believe that Atlantis is not beyond the Atlantic, as Plato said, but here, among the islands that still float against Greece. The Aegean Islands, for example, keep secrets under their lands. Among them, one stands out: Santorini, formerly called Thera. In the heart of this island, about 3,600 years ago, something devastating happened. A volcano exploded with an almost indescribable fury. The eruption was so violent that he not only broke the island, but covered the sky, changed the weather, and perhaps, only perhaps, he erased an entire civilization. The remains of the city of Akrotiri, buried in ash, show us murals, constructions, and details that speak of a sophisticated and advanced culture. Could this have been the Atlantis? Some believe it. The similarity between the sudden destruction of Thera and the Platonic story is disturbing. But there is a problem. Santorini is small. too small to be the great continent described by the philosopher. And yet, at the intimate of the night, not everything needs to fit to be true. Sometimes suggestion is enough. Others look towards the Atlantic, the ocean that bears the name of Atlantis itself. Here, theories bloom like corals. Some point to the Azores Islands, today part of Portugal, located just beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. They say that in remote times, before thawing, that archipelago was part of a more extensive land, a land that was then swallowed by the sea. This idea was especially popular among 19th century writers, fascinated by ancient maps and Egyptian stories. But until today, no clear evidence of structures submerged in the region has been found. Only fragments, natural formations, and the eternal open question. And yet, not all mystery lives in the Old World. There are those who say that Atlantis is in the heart of South America, deep in the Bolivian highlands, an immense plateau surrounded by mountains where the lakes seem mirrors of the sky. In this region is the Andean Altiplano, and within it a place called the Altiplano of the Pampa Auyagas region. Here, some researchers have identified circular patterns, geography similar to that described, central hills, concentric water bodies, and remains of ancient cultures. There is even talk of a lost city under the waters of Lake Popo. Coincidence? Projection? Or perhaps the echo of an older memory than any border? The fascinating thing about this theory is that South America keeps its own legends, as powerful as the Greek. Cultures such as Tiwanaku, the Incas, the pre-Columbian peoples, spoke of gold cities, of lost empires, civilizations that came from the waters. Maybe the Atlantis was not only Greek. Maybe he lived in more than one heart. And there is even more. Some look for Atlantis in the most inhospitable place in the world, Antarctica. Impossible, many say. But in the impossibility, the fascination is born. This theory starts from a bold idea, that Antarctica was not always covered with ice, that in ancient times it could have been a fertile, habitable, even civilized land. Some old maps, such as Piri Reis, show the Antarctic region without ice, with detailed coasts. Where did that knowledge come from? Is it possible that an advanced civilization has existed there, and that the cataclysm that destroyed it was not water, but ice? Speculation, no doubt, but powerful. And if it is not in the Mediterranean, neither in the Atlantic, nor in America, nor in the South frozen, is there any place for Atlantis? Yes, the bottom of the sea. Not as mystical location, but as a geological reality. The planet is dynamic. The tectonic plates move, the continents sink and emerge. There are entire regions under the ocean that have not yet been explored. The Meso-Atlantic dorsal, for example, is an underwater mountain range that extends like a scar at the bottom of the ocean. Some say that there, in the abyss between plates, there could be a continental platform that collapsed. Other theories point to areas near the Caribbean, where submerged structures have aroused interest, although none has proven artificial. However, the ocean is vast and deep, and the Atlantis, if it ever lived, could be there, covered with coral, asleep under kilometers of water, forgotten by men, remembered only by fish and dreams. The geography of Atlantis is not a place. It is a question. And that question has 1,000 answers, all impossible, all poetic. When looking for her, we are not just tracking ruins. We are chasing the desire that something bigger, more wise, older than us has ever existed. Not everything was lost. That under the noise of the modern world, there are still secrets that have not been touched by the light. Tonight, while the body is delivered to the dream, let the soul fly. Not towards a cardinal point, but towards an echo. Because in every wave that breaks, in each shadow underwater, Atlantis could be. And, who knows, maybe he still hopes to be found. Maybe he's waiting for you.
There are stories that begin with light, with harmony, with a sigh of balance between man, earth, and divine. Stories where everything seems possible, where justice is not a dream, and abundance does not corrupt. But even those stories, perhaps especially those, keep an inevitable shadow in their nucleus. Because the perfect, when it extends too much, seems to awaken a kind of tiredness in the gods. And so, what he ascends without measure ends up attracting his fall. The Atlantis, according to Plato, was a civilization like no other. Rich, wise, strong, not only in the material, but also in spirit. Founded by descendants of Poseidon, the first Atlanteans lived in harmony with the laws of heaven. Its culture was not built on blind power, but on virtue. They practiced justice with balance, cultivated the earth with respect, and did not let themselves be seduced by excess. It was, in essence, a kingdom where the collective soul still remembered its divine origin. Its architecture was the reflection of that balance. Circular cities, concentric and water rings, bridges that connected the human with the sacred. The central palace, located on the inner island, was surrounded by gardens, temples, channels, and columns. The orichalco, that bright and mysterious metal, decorated ceilings and walls. There were markets, schools, temples for the gods, and squares where people gathered not only to trade, but to talk, share ideas, and reinforce the common fabric that united them. Its natural wealth of Atlantis was inexhaustible. Minerals, woods, pure waters, animals in abundance. And, as if that were not enough, the fertility of his land made the food never miss. It was an empire that I did not need to conquer, because everything I could desire already had it. And yet, that is where the slip begins. At that exact point where satisfaction begins to blur the purpose, where having becomes more important than being. Plato tells us that over time the Atlanteans began to forget. Not abruptly, but slowly, as who stops looking at the sky because he gets used to his light. They moved away from virtue. They stopped hearing the voice of the gods. They began to be valued more for their power than by their wisdom. His society, formerly balanced, became ambitious. They were no longer content with what they had. They wanted more. They wanted to dominate. The Atlantes began to expand. They sailed beyond their coasts, imposed their influence on other lands, and, in that process, the original harmony was fading. Larger temples were built, but with less soul. More gold accumulated, but the sense of community was lost. And what was once a civilization guided by the divine law became an empire corrupted by desire. Then, says Plato, the gods observed. And, as a gardener who sadly contemplates how a perfect flower begins to wilt from within, they decided to act. Not for anger, not for revenge, but for balance. Because everything that moves too much from its center must be brought back. The destruction of Atlantis was as fast as definitive. In one night, says the philosopher, earthquakes, torrential rains, and giant waves covered the island. There was no time to escape. There was no warning. The cities broke, the temples collapsed, the channels sank. And in a matter of hours, everything that was once a symbol of perfection became submerged ruin. What was not destroyed by water was swallowed by the earth. And what was not covered by the earth was erased from memory. Or almost. Why did this happen? Why should the gods punish their own children? Plato does not speak of cruel punishment, but of a rebalance. Atlantis symbolizes for him the inevitable fall of any civilization that forgets its essence. No matter how big, how rich, how powerful it is, a culture, if you lose contact with the fair, if you slide towards arrogance, if you transform your wisdom into vanity, then your destiny is sealed. Atlantis, then, is not just a catastrophe story. It is a mirror. It shows us what we are able to build, but also what we can destroy. It represents the eternal cycle of human societies: emergence, splendor, decline, oblivion. And he does it with a melancholic elegance, as who knows that history is not repeated, but rhyme. In many cultures, old and modern, we find similar narratives. Golden cities that sink, towers that collapse by pride, kingdoms that disappear for disobeying the gods. From Babylon to Sodom, from El Dorado to Lemuria, humanity seems obsessed with warning itself, as if each generation need a reminder. Everything that shines goes out. Everything that ascends without humility ends up falling. And yet, deep down, there is no absolute sadness in the history of Atlantis. There is a deep beauty at its destination. Because if something so perfect existed, even in the imagination, it forces us to aspire to something better. It reminds us that balance is not a goal, but a path. And the true wisdom is not to avoid the fall, but to recognize when we are moving away from the center. Tonight, while you close your eyes and the world becomes slower, think of that ancient island, in its light, in its glory, in its final silence. And ask yourself the question that were asked so many before. Do we live today in our own Atlantis? Are we still the first children of Poseidon, or have we already begun to forget? Maybe there is no answer. Maybe there is only a soft murmur between the waves. Maybe all that remains is to listen and dream of a city that was, or that could be again.
Part 4. History, Science, and Madness.
There are myths that rest in mist as old memories, hoping to be forgotten. Others, however, refuse to silence. They transform, evolve, mutate with the times. Atlantis is one of those rebel myths. He has traveled for centuries as a luminous, dodge, impossible to catch. But unlike other legends, it was not trapped in the margins of ancient stories. No, Atlantis infiltrated the real history, in the laboratories of science, in the offices of governments, in the networks of impossible theories, and in the lights of pop culture. From obsessed archaeologists to totalitarian regimes, from satellites in orbit to modern video games, everyone wanted to touch their mystery. Tonight, let's go down with that uncertain ladder where history, science, and madness shake hands. At the end of the 19th century, a man named Ignatius Donnelly became one of the first to bring the myth of Atlantis beyond the philosophical texts. Donnelly was not a traditional academic. He was a politician, writer, and a tenacious dreamer. In his work, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, he proposed that Atlantis had been a mother civilization, prior to the Great Flood that so many cultures remember. For him, Atlantis was the common root of all great human advances: agriculture, architecture, languages. A bold idea, rejected by the science of his time, but found echo in thousands of fascinated readers. His book marked a new line. It was no longer just an old story. It was now a research topic, a search, a call. With the passage of time, theories multiplied. Some sought Atlantis in ancient texts, others in excavations, and some in heaven. With the advancement of technology, digital explorers emerged that, from their homes, examined the background of the ocean through tools such as Google Earth. Sometimes discoveries were announced: straight lines in the seabed, submerged structures, shapes that seemed artificial. But always, in the end, the same question arose: are we seeing what is really there, or what we want to see? The desire to find Atlantis became so deep that it was even absorbed by the darkest projects in modern history. During World War II, the Nazi regime, particularly under the figure of Heinrich Himmler, developed an obsessive fascination with the mythical origins of humanity. The Ahnenerbe organization, financed by the Third Reich, made expeditions all over the world looking for vestiges of an alleged upper ancestral race. On his trips to Tibet, Iceland, to South America, the shadow of Atlantis was always present, not as a romantic place, but as a hidden key in the construction of a myth of power. Under that look, Atlantis became a political symbol, into pseudo-scientific justification, in propaganda tool. It was one of the most tragic ways in which madness used a myth to build fear. But the mystery did not end there. Over time, other types of theories emerged. Beyond history, beyond the Earth, Atlantis began to link with the hypothesis of the ancient astronauts. According to this current, Atlantean civilization did not arise from traditional human evolution, but from contact with intelligences from heaven. Atlanteans would have received advanced knowledge, free energy, monumental construction, astronomical navigation. And when those visitors left, or when the men abused the delivered power, the civilization collapsed. These ideas, although far from the scientific consensus, have found fertile ground in documentaries, books, and millions of people desired for an explanation that encompasses the inexplicable. It is here that science is intertwined with myth, and where imagination opens paths that logic still does not dare to step on. And so, among imagined ruins and interplanetary contacts, Atlantis reached contemporary culture. It became a symbol, into a stage, in narrative excuse. It appears in films, in novels, in series, in video games. Disney, for example, presented its own version in Atlantis, the Lost Empire, where the city was a vestige of an advanced civilization that combined technology and spirituality. In the world of video games, titles such as Assassins created Atlantis as an immortal construction, a mixture of secret history and forbidden science. Each new generation reimagines the Atlantis in its own way, as if it were a canvas to project their wishes, their fears, their questions. The question is, why is still alive? Why don't this myth die? Maybe because it represents more than a lost city. Perhaps it symbolizes a collective memory, a nostalgia of what we were, or what we could have been. In a fragmented, accelerated, and many times empty world, Atlantis offers a promise that there was a time when humanity lived in balance, that something better was possible, and also a warning that everything that ascends without wisdom sinks. Tonight, while darkness embraces your thoughts, maybe you can understand something else. Atlantis is not just an archaeological search. It is a crack on the surface of the real, a place where the desire to know and the fear of remembering, where history, science, and madness are intertwined as sea currents in the abyss. Sleep with that image. Let the question dissolve in the dream, because perhaps, deep down, we all carry a secret map towards Atlantis, one that is not compass, or satellites, or with theories, but with silence, with imagination, and with a heart that still dares to believe. In the stillness of the night, when the external lights go out and only the slight pulse of consciousness remains, something deep begins to emerge. It has no precise name. It does not arrive with words. It is rather a rubbing, a presence barely intuited, as a melody you already knew, even if you never heard it, like a souvenir without form, persistent, soft. Maybe that is Atlantis. Not a lost city, not a sunk continent, but something that lives in another plane, one that is not accessed with maps, but with silence. What if Atlantis is within us? That is the question that remains when the story ends, when dust sits and theories dissolve, when there is no need to prove its physical existence. The echo remains, the symbol remains, because there are things that do not need to have happened to be deeply true. The Atlantis, since its first mention, was offered as much more than a story. It was presented as an impossible memory, a sigh of the human soul, because of the lost, the forgotten, what we once thought. And although the wise discuss their location and scientists deny their remains, their image is still alive. Not because it has been a real city, but because it represents something we are still looking for. Perhaps Atlantis symbolizes the childhood of humanity, that idealized moment where everything was new, pure, balanced, a time without hurry, without excess, without noise. An inner state that we have been abandoning as the world became more complex, faster, farther from itself. Atlantis not as a place, but as a sensation, a shelter that we once lived and now only exists in dreams. There is something deeply human in that yearning, in that nostalgia of what we do not remember, but we miss the same. It happens with the songs, with the aromas, with certain landscapes. We felt that we already knew them before we found them, that something inside us responds without knowing why. This also happens with Atlantis. When we listen to his name, something moves. Maybe because he does not speak of external ruins, but of internal structures, of the pillars that once held us, and that, over the years, we have been dropping. In each person there is an Atlantis. There is a noble, fair, luminous part which knew how to live in balance, who knew the value of silence, of the right word, of the sincere look. But, like the ancient Atlanteans, many times we move away from that. We lose ourselves in the noise, in the meaningless search, in the hurry of the immediate. And suddenly, one day, we notice that something has sunk, that there is a part of us that no longer shines. And we look for her, in memories, in dreams, in the stories. That search is what makes us human, the desire to return, to rebuild not a lost city, but a state of soul, to recover the essential, to remember what we are when we stop running, when we look inside. Maybe that's why so many cultures have created their own Atlantis. Not because they copied to each other, but because we shared the same yearning. Each civilization has its myth of the fall, his golden memory, your warning. Because all, somehow, we have felt that something valuable has been lost, and each generation tries to recover it in its own way. Atlantis, then, is also a promise, one possibility. If something so perfect existed, perhaps we can still build something similar, not in stone, not in metal, but in our decisions, in our links, in the way we inhabit the world. We may not need to find her. We may need to remember it, not as archaeologists, but as poets. And there is his power, in that ability to keep talking to us century after century, without tiredness. Because it does not depend on evidence or excavations. It depends on the heart. And as long as there is someone to hear, to imagine, to dream, the Atlantis will not sink at all. Tonight, while the body is delivered to rest, let these words accommodate inside you. Do not try to understand them. Don't look for answers. He just feels. Let yourself wrapped by the quiet rumor of the old, the deep, the invisible. Maybe in that space without form, between sleep and vigil, between the real and the impossible, you find something you had lost. Something that was always there, but you had stopped looking. And if you find it, even if it is an instant, take care of it, guard it, because that, perhaps, is your own Atlantis. The Atlantis. Maybe it was never stone or sea, but a whisper who lives in all those who dream of returning home.